across the broken spine of Europe, where cities still smoldered in silence replaced the roar of bombers. The world exhaled for the first time in 6 long years. Church bells rang through shattered cathedrals, rifles fired into the air in celebration, and flags of liberation unfurled above the ruins. For millions, it was the long-awaited end, the moment when nightmares finally loosened their grip. But for a small group of young women standing among the crumbling railway yards of northern Germany, the day that others called victory felt more like an ending of another kind. They wore tattered remnants of uniforms, faded green jackets with missing buttons, threadbare skirts stained by mud and smoke. Their boots were split at the seams, their hair matted from weeks without proper washing. Beneath the grime, traces of youth still clung to their faces, fragile reminders that most of them were barely 20. They were not soldiers in the usual sense, not killers, not officers, but secretaries, radio operators, nurses, clerks, women who had kept the machinery of the Reich running from behind the lines. Now, that machinery lay in ruins, and the women stood among its ashes, uncertain whether they were survivors or ghosts. The orders came quietly. They were to be transported west. No one said where. No one dared ask. The once proud auxiliaries of the German war machine, the Helferinnen, were now prisoners, gathered into lines and marched toward trains that smelled of oil, rust, and fear. The boxcars waiting for them had once carried troops toward battle. Now they waited for these young women. Some clutched small suitcases, others carried nothing but a folded photograph or a rosary hidden in a pocket. As the women climbed into the dark interiors of the wooden cars, a low murmur spread among them. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. "The Americans will not spare us," whispered a girl from Hamburg, her voice trembling. "They will make examples of us." She had heard it from a Luftwaffe officer during the chaos of surrender that the Allied soldiers were wolves in human skin, eager for revenge. Another woman, taller, with the hard eyes of someone who had spent nights under air raids, said nothing. She simply clenched her jaw, her silence saying more than words could. When the train began to move, the landscape of the defeated Reich slid past in a blur of gray and smoke. What had once been villages and towns now looked like burned-out skeletons. Churches without steeples jutted against the sky like broken bones. Factories lay twisted and gutted, their smokestacks drooping like necks that had been snapped. Here and there, children waved from the ruins, their faces pale and hollow. Inside the cars, the air grew heavy. The women sat close together, huddling against the cold steel and one another's bodies for warmth. At night, when the train stopped, they could hear gunfire far away, stray echoes of a war that was supposed to be over. One woman began to cry softly, another muttered a prayer under her breath, and the rest simply stared into the dark. Among them sat Anna Weiss, a 23-year-old former secretary from Munich. She had worked in an office that processed military orders, typing commands she never read, names she never questioned. Now she carried only a small notebook, hidden beneath her blouse, her diary. By the flicker of a dying candle, she wrote, "We are being taken somewhere far. None of us knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps she will be right." The train's journey stretched on for days that blurred into one another, long hours of jolting metal and sleepless eyes. When it finally stopped, it was not in Germany at all, but in the chaos of an occupied port city, Bremen, perhaps, or Le Havre, or Cherbourg. The air reeked of salt and diesel. Ships under American flags loomed over the docks, their hulls massive, their decks crawling with uniformed men. The women were herded off the trains and marched toward the gangways. Soldiers stood watching, not with anger, but with the kind of detached curiosity one might reserve for an exhibit. Some faces were hard, others indifferent. The women had expected blows, shouts, humiliation. Instead, there was silence, paperwork, lines, and orders delivered in measured tones. They were counted, tagged, divided into groups. The efficiency of it was almost eerie, a cold bureaucracy of captivity. Still, as the ship's engines rumbled to life and the gray coastline of Europe began to fade into mist, dread settled into every stomach like a stone. The Atlantic stretched ahead, vast, merciless, and unknown. Somewhere beyond that endless water lay the enemy's homeland, America, a land they had been taught to fear as the heart of barbarism, a place of greedy conquerors and soulless machines. On board, the days bled into one another. The women were kept below deck in steel holds that smelled of salt and metal. The air was thick and humid. Many grew seasick. Meals were served on trays, pale bread, slices of meat, steaming coffee poured into tin cups. For a moment, the women only stared at it. For years, their meals had been scraps, black bread made from sawdust and barley, soup so thin it was little more than warm water. One girl hesitated to eat, whispering that it might be poisoned. Another, trembling, took a bite of bread and then another, tears falling silently as she chewed. "They feed us like they feed themselves," she said in disbelief. But why? It was not kindness they expected, it was vengeance. And yet the food kept coming, plain but plentiful, and the strangeness of it unsettled them more than cruelty ever could. When the ships finally reached the American coast, the women crowded onto the deck, gripping the rails as if to steady themselves against a world they no longer understood. The skyline rose before them, tall buildings unscarred by bombs, blast towers gleaming in sunlight. The Statue of Liberty stood over the harbor, her torch raised high, her face unreadable. Some of the women turned away, others could not stop staring. It was the first city they had seen intact in years, and it felt like stepping into another universe. Crowds gathered on the piers as the ships docked. Some Americans jeered, others simply watched in silence. The women were led ashore under guard, their boots echoing on the planks. The air smelled cleaner here, lighter, salted by the ocean, but untouched by the ash of war. For the first time, many understood that the Reich was gone. The world they had known had ended, and they were walking through the territory of their former nightmares. Buses and trains took them inland. Through the windows, America unfolded, a land of green fields, white-painted houses, children riding bicycles through quiet streets. To women who had watched their own cities burn to ash, the sight was unbearable. "It's as if the war never happened here," one murmured. The others said nothing. Their destination was not freedom, but a network of camps spread across the United States, places with names that meant nothing to them: Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and dozens of others scattered across the heartland. When the buses finally stopped, the women saw rows of wooden barracks surrounded by fences and barbed wire. Guard towers stood at intervals, but even these looked strangely clean, almost orderly. There was no smell of rot or blood, only cut grass and dust. At the gates, they were registered and searched. Their names were written in American script, their possessions logged and stored. Their old uniforms were taken and replaced with plain work clothes. The process was cold, methodical, but never cruel. Still, fear clung to them like a second skin. Then came the order that froze every heart: they were to be taken into a building, one by one. No one explained why. The sound of hissing steam echoed from within, and the women looked at each other in panic. "This is it," whispered one. "This is where they'll humiliate us." The line moved slowly. One girl clutched her suitcase as if it were armor. Another crossed herself silently. But when they entered the tiled room, the reality stunned them into silence. There were no soldiers with whips, no jeering guards. Instead, attendants handed them bars of soap, real soap, heavy and fragrant, smelling faintly of flowers. Towels followed. Then came the showers. Hot water poured down from the pipes in steady streams. It hit their skin like fire at first, then melted the grime of months away. For the first time in years, they felt clean. Their hair loosened. Their hands trembled as they touched their faces, smooth and alive beneath the dirt. Some began to laugh. Others wept, unable to stop. The sound of their tears echoed off the tiles like music from another world. That night, Anna opened her diary again and wrote, "By the dim light of a lantern we were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, they gave us soap. How can this be?" She did not yet know that the memory of that simple shower of warm water and the scent of clean skin would haunt her far longer than the war itself. The women lay in their bunks, wrapped in blankets that smelled of starch. Outside, the night hummed softly with crickets. No sirens, no bombs, no marching boots, only peace, quiet and unnatural. They whispered to each other in the dark, voices trembling with disbelief. "Perhaps they are not as we were told." One said, "Perhaps." Another replied, "Perhaps they are something else." And as dawn began to rise beyond the camp fences, washing the world in pale gold, a new thought crept into every mind: if the enemy could show such humanity, what else had they been wrong about? It was the first day of their captivity, but in a strange, quiet way, it also felt like the first day of something new, the beginning of an awakening none of them had expected. The morning sun burned through the mist that clung to the camp's barbed wire. The buses that had brought the women now sat idle by the gate, engines cooling, dust settling on their wheels. Inside, the new captives stood in rows, silent and watchful. The Americans moved among them, efficient but not unkind, their voices clipped and calm. To the women, every sound was strange: the rustle of uniforms, the clang of metal gates, the echo of orders given in English. It was a rhythm of authority they did not yet understand. The air smelled of pine and soap, not smoke and fear, and that alone unsettled them. They were prisoners, yes, but not the way they had imagined. There were no beatings, no curses, no lines of men leering at them as they had been warned. Instead, the Americans handed them numbered tags and directed them with gestures more practical than cruel. Some guards even looked embarrassed, as if unsure how to treat women who had once been the enemy. 4 hours. The women stood under the pale Georgia sun, waiting as each name was called, each document stamped. When their numbers were recorded, they were escorted to their quarters, long wooden barracks lined with bunks, smelling faintly of detergent and sawdust. It was not comfort, but it was safety, and that alone confused them. The first real shock, however, came not from paperwork or the guards, but from the mess hall. When the bell rang, they followed the others, mostly captured soldiers, into a long building with wide windows and bright electric lights. The smell hit them first: coffee, roasted meat, fresh bread. They stopped in the doorway, stunned. Steam rose from trays filled with food: boiled potatoes, carrots, thick stew that shimmered with fat, rolls gleamed with melted butter, and mugs of coffee waited, dark and fragrant. The women hesitated, unable to move. They had prepared for hunger, humiliation, perhaps even starvation. Instead, they were being offered a feast. A guard gestured them forward. Reluctantly, they stepped to the counter. The cooks behind it, some young, some older, served them without a word. Metal plates clattered. The women took their trays with shaking hands, walking as if in a trance toward the tables. Anna sat down, staring at the food. For a moment, she could not bring herself to eat. The smell of meat was overwhelming. Her stomach clenched, half from hunger, half from disbelief. Then she took a small spoonful, bringing it to her lips. It was rich, salty, real. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Around her, others began to eat slowly at first, then hungrily, the sound of spoons and forks echoing through the hall. Some wept openly, some laughed softly through their tears. One woman whispered, her voice barely audible, "My brothers froze in the snow while fighting them, and here they feed us like this." It was not kindness they had expected, and that was what made it harder to bear. The guards patrolled the edges of the room, watching with expressions that revealed little. One young American, perhaps no older than the prisoners themselves, gave a brief nod when his eyes met Anna's. He looked awkward, almost apologetic, as if unsure what role he was supposed to play, captor or host. In that moment, Anna realized something unsettling. She was more afraid of their decency than of their cruelty. Cruelty would have justified everything she had been told, but this forced her to question. Days passed. The women learned the routines of captivity. Each morning began with a bell, followed by roll call and breakfast: oatmeal, sometimes eggs, occasionally fruit. They were assigned work details, some in kitchens, others in laundries, others in the fields just beyond the camp's fences. Anna was sent to the laundry. She spent her days scrubbing American uniforms, the fabric rough beneath her hands, the air heavy with steam. At first, she worked mechanically, not thinking, but soon she began to notice small things: the faint smell of aftershave on the collars, the initials sewn into each shirt, the careful stitching on a pocket. These were not monsters' clothes. They belonged to men who laughed, sweated, maybe missed home as much as she did. The realization unsettled her deeply. Each afternoon, the women were given an hour to themselves. Some wrote letters, though most would never reach home, while others sat in the shade, staring through the fences at the distant trees. They watched American soldiers come and go, laughing, smoking, living as though the world outside had not burned. Sometimes, a breeze carried music from a nearby radio: jazz, swing, voices singing in a language that felt impossibly alive. The women listened in silence, their eyes distant. A few even hummed along, embarrassed by their own longing for something that sounded so free. The camp's canteen became a place of both wonder and confusion. The women were paid small wages for their work, camp currency they could spend on goods inside: chocolate, cigarettes, pencils, even lipstick. The first time Anna saw the shelves, she froze. It was like stepping into a dream from before the war. Bars of chocolate wrapped in shiny paper, bottles of Coca-Cola, soap that smelled like summer. She reached out, touched a chocolate bar, and pulled her hand back as if burned. A girl from Bremen beside her whispered, "Go on, they said we can buy them." Anna handed over 2 slips of camp script. The bar was cold and solid in her palm. She unwrapped it, broke off a small piece, and placed it on her tongue. Sweetness flooded her mouth. It was the taste of a world she thought had been destroyed forever. She turned away quickly, hiding her tears. The contradictions piled up with every passing day. The enemy who had bombed their cities now gave them soap, food, and work. The people they had feared were not wolves but ordinary men, some kind, some indifferent, some even shy. And yet the shame of that realization cut deeper than any insult could have. Letters from home began to arrive, thin envelopes scrawled with desperate handwriting. They spoke of ruin, starvation, loss. One woman read aloud by the dim light of the barracks, "We live in the cellar now. The house above is gone. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, send it." No one spoke afterward. Some folded their letters and placed them under their pillows. Others sat staring into nothing, their plates of food untouched. The guilt of being fed, of surviving in comfort while their country starved, hung heavy in the air. At night, whispers spread through the bunks. "What if it's all a trick?" One woman muttered. "What if they only pretend to be kind so we let our guard down?" Another answered quietly, "Then why would they feed us every day?" But suspicion dies slowly, and old fears die slower. Some women hid bread crusts beneath their mattresses, convinced the food would stop. Others refused to bathe, fearing the soap might carry poison. Yet each day passed, and nothing happened. No cruelty, no punishment, just routine, strange, peaceful routine. The women's bodies began to change, their faces filled out, color returned to their cheeks, the hollow look of hunger faded. They began to resemble, once again, the people they had been before the war stole their youth. The Americans noticed too. "They're healthier now than when we found them," one guard remarked. Another replied, "Yeah, they look like they could walk right out of here and start over." But for the prisoners, that was exactly what frightened them, the idea that they could start over, that life might continue beyond hatred. Anna's diary grew thicker each week, filled with questions she could not answer. "I eat and I feel alive again. I sleep and I dream of things that do not frighten me. But how can I feel gratitude toward the enemy? It feels like betrayal, not of my country, but of the dead." Sometimes, when she washed uniforms, she imagined the faces of the men who wore them not as faceless conquerors, but as people who wrote letters home, who missed their mothers, who feared dying far from home. She hated herself for that thought, and yet she could not stop it. The guards, too, began to change in her eyes. One dropped his flashlight one evening during roll call. Anna bent instinctively, picked it up, and handed it back. Their hands brushed for the briefest second. The young man nodded, almost shyly, before stepping away. 4 days. She thought about that single touch, how it felt human, uncalculated. A week later, as she worked in the laundry, another soldier passed by humming a tune. A girl from Cologne recognized it instantly, a melody from an old American film that had somehow made its way into Germany before the war. Without thinking, she hummed along. The soldier looked back, surprised, then smiled faintly and continued walking. It was such a small exchange, yet it carried the weight of something profound. The moment two enemies shared the same rhythm, the same sound, the same fleeting reminder of normal life. Not all Americans were kind. Some looked at the women with open hatred, their grief for fallen brothers carved deep into their expressions. But even their hostility was controlled, contained by discipline. No beatings came, no shouted insults, only silence, and in that silence, the women began to hear themselves think for the first time in years. The world inside the camp was slowly rewiring their understanding of everything they had believed. The enemy was not a beast. The enemy was just a man. And that realization was more terrifying than any weapon. As weeks turned into months, the routines dulled the sharp edges of fear. Morning bell, work detail, supper, lights out. The sameness of it all gave their minds space to wander, to remember, to regret. Anna found herself staring at the horizon one evening as the sun dipped low, turning the sky into a river of gold. The fields outside the fence shimmered with tall grass, and beyond them, she could see the faint outline of houses, American houses, untouched, perfect. Her throat tightened. "Our world burned to ashes," she wrote that night. "There's never even trembled." The thought lingered as she drifted to sleep, the hum of crickets rising through the open window. The war was over. Yet another battle had begun, one fought not with guns, but with the slow, unbearable confrontation between truth and belief. And in that quiet war, many of them were already losing. Winter came quietly that year. The Georgia pines turned brittle and brown, and the mornings were cold enough that the women's breath hung white in the air as they lined up for roll call. The war in Europe was long over, but its echoes reached them still, in letters, in rumors, in the hollow silence that followed every new list of names posted on the camp notice board. By then, the women no longer flinched at the guards' voices. The rhythms of the camp had become their second heartbeat. They woke, they worked, they ate, they slept. The same faces, the same routines, Yet beneath that saneness, something irreversible had changed. They were no longer the women who had stepped off those buses months ago, eyes full of fear and defiance. They had been stripped of uniforms, slogans, illusions. What remained were simply women, tired, human, uncertain. The transformation showed in the smallest of ways. In the laundry, laughter had returned, cautious at first, then genuine. They told stories about home, about children they might never see again, about food they used to cook before rationing and bombs took it all away. One girl taught another how to braid her hair again, saying softly, "It feels wrong to forget beauty." Sometimes, the guards overheard and smiled, pretending not to. The Americans, too, had changed. The war had aged them in ways invisible to the eye. Some of them, after months of duty, began to treat the prisoners less like enemies and more like distant cousins of the same human tragedy. They learned bits of German, enough to say good morning or work's done. The words were awkward, but the gestures behind them were not. One evening, after a storm had passed, the power went out. The camp lay in darkness, silent except for the rain dripping from the eaves. Someone no one ever learned who began to hum an old lullaby. Others joined in, their voices rising softly, blending into the sound of rain. It was a song known in both languages. The melody was older than the war, older than politics, older than hatred. When the lights flickered back to life, some of the guards were standing near the fence, listening. No one spoke. It was as if the night itself had reminded them that before they were enemies, they were simply people who sang the same songs to their children. In that fragile moment, the distance between the captives and the captors thinned to almost nothing, but the outside world did not share that tenderness. News came of trials in Europe, generals, ministers, officers standing before judges. Words like atrocity and crimes reached the camp, heavy and inescapable. The women read the newspapers that the guards discarded. Some wept, some denied, some simply stared into space, their faces unreadable. Anna could not look away. She read every line, every verdict, every testimony. The names of towns she recognized appeared beside words like massacre, gas, and camp. Her hands trembled as she held the pages. For the first time, she wondered what her own silence had cost. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind outside, her thoughts heavy with shame she could not name. Were we blind, or did we choose to be? She wrote in her diary, "If this is what we fought for, what does that make us?" The next morning, she walked out to the field where she worked, the one where wildflowers sometimes grew along the fence. She knelt, dug her fingers into the soil, and felt its warmth. The earth did not care about nations or borders. It only remembered seasons. From then on, Anna worked differently, slower, more deliberate, as though each motion were an act of quiet penance. Life in the camp settled into something almost normal. The women sewed, cleaned, tended gardens. The guards rotated out, replaced by new ones who carried fewer ghosts in their eyes. Occasionally, a visiting officer would tour the grounds, clipboard in hand, checking conditions. They seemed content, he would remark, unaware that contentment and grief can coexist in the same breath. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late spring when the order arrived. The war was over. The prisoners were to be released. The announcement spread through the camp like a ripple of disbelief. Some cheered, some cried, others stood motionless, unsure whether freedom was something they still knew how to hold. The gates that had once symbolized fear now represented uncertainty. Beyond them lay a country they no longer recognized, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, homes gone. What did freedom mean when everything that once gave it shape had burned away? Anna sat on her bunk, the letter of release in her hand. Around her, women packed what little they owned, a comb, a scarf, a few photographs, the diary she kept hidden under her pillow. When her name was called, she stepped forward. A young American officer handed her papers, then looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "You're free to go," he said. His voice was soft, uncertain, almost regretful. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. She nodded instead. As she walked toward the gate, the gravel crunching under her boots, she glanced back. The camp stretched behind her, wooden barracks, wire fences, towers against the sky. She had hated it once. Now it felt strangely familiar, almost safe. The world beyond looked too bright, too open. At the gate, one of the guards she knew, the same young man whose flashlight she had once handed back, lifted his cap slightly. "Good luck," he said quietly. Anna hesitated, then did something she never thought she would. She extended her hand. For a heartbeat, he froze. Then he took it. Their handshake was brief, wordless, but it carried the weight of everything that had passed between their nations: war, death, mercy, misunderstanding. When she pulled away, her eyes stung. She walked through the gate and did not look back again. The journey home was long and silent. Trains rolled past burned-out towns, fields scattered with wreckage. The women stared through the windows, seeing ghosts in every shadow. Villages were gone, bridges collapsed, cities hollowed into skeletons. When Anna reached what remained of her home, she found only walls blackened by fire. Her mother's house had been flattened by bombs. The neighbors were strangers. The town itself smelled of dust and sorrow. She stood amid the ruins, holding her diary to her chest. For the first time in her life, she did not know who she was: not a soldier's wife, not a patriot, not a prisoner, just a survivor. And survival, she realized, was its own quiet defiance. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, she rebuilt what little she could: a roof from tin, a door from scavenged wood. She traded her camp rations for tools, learned to grow vegetables in the same soil that had once hidden shrapnel. At night, she still dreamed of the camp, the fences, the smell of coffee, the hum of that song in the rain. But in those dreams, there was no fear anymore. Only faces, German and American, merging into the same fragile humanity. One afternoon, while clearing debris from a half-burned church, she found a page of an old newspaper, brittle but legible. It was dated months after her release. There was a small article tucked between columns of politics and reconstruction. Several hundred German women prisoners repatriated from U.S. camps report humane treatment, good health, and fair conditions. Many expressed disbelief at the kindness shown by former enemies. Anna read the line twice. Then she folded the page carefully and placed it in her diary. That night, by the light of a small oil lamp, she wrote the final entry: "We went to war believing the enemy was evil. We were taught that mercy was weakness and that hate was duty. But captivity taught us something else, that even those we feared could still choose decency. Perhaps that is what victory truly means, not who destroyed more, but who remembered how to remain human." She closed the diary and sat listening to the wind. It carried faint sounds from the valley: laughter, footsteps, the beginning of life returning. Somewhere far across the ocean, men who once guarded her were probably living their own new lives, raising children who would never know her name. And that, she thought, was how peace was supposed to begin: not with flags or speeches, but with quiet forgiveness between people who had every reason to hate. The stars above were cold and distant, but for the first time in years, Anna looked at them without bitterness. War had taken everything, but it had also left her with one unbearable, beautiful truth: that humanity can survive even the ruins of its own madness. She whispered into the night, not to anyone, but to herself, to the memory of all she had seen never again. And somewhere, in that vast silence, it felt as though the world finally agreed.